It could have been the worst crash in aviation history. Last year, an Air Canada plane attempted to land on a taxiway instead of a runway at the San Francisco International Airport. It was just a few feet away from crashing into other planes packed with fuel and passengers before it swooped back up. U.S. safety officials say pilot fatigue was partly to blame for the near miss. The pilot had been awake for 19 hours, which is okay in Canada, but not in the U.S., where there are stricter rest requirements. Today, Canada's Transportation Safety Board has released a report calling for change. It says employee fatigue is pervasive in the transportation industry. How at risk are Canadians if things don't change? Joining me now is the chair of the Transportation Safety Board, Kathy Fox. Hi, Ms. Fox. Nice to see you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for coming in. Your report found fatigue to be a major issue across sectors. What is the challenge there?
Well, the TSB watch list identifies the key safety issues that need to be addressed, and we introduced fatigue for railway operating crews back in 2016. But in this updated version, we've looked at the same issue in other modes, including marine and air. So what we'd like to see is employees need to have a better awareness of what they can do to mitigate the risk of fatigue in themselves. What companies need to have fatigue management plans. So how do they manage employee schedules to provide adequate opportunities for rest? And the regulator rather has to have regulations that require companies to have fatigue management plans to mitigate the risk of fatigue in their operations.
How widespread is the problem? And can you give me an example, for example, of when it was? Because I know your report said that it was a risk or a contributing factor in 90 investigations since 1992.
That's right. So since 1992, we've had 90 investigations where fatigue was a risk or contributing factor. So in rails, we've seen situations where there have been derailments or collisions because operating crews didn't properly interpret rail signals and went through a signal. In air, we've seen situations where pilot performance was impacted, and so that impacts their vigilance, their decision-making, their willingness to take risky decisions. In marine, we had an accident a couple of years ago where a marine watchkeeper fell asleep, missed a planned course turn off the west coast of British Columbia, and caused the tug and barge to capsize and sink, spilling about 110,000 liters of oil. So fatigue is pervasive in society, and particularly in transportation, because it's 24/7, and employees are often working irregular schedules at night, sometimes crossing multiple time zones. So more needs to be done to mitigate the risk of fatigue.
I think the example that would probably be really familiar to our viewers is the one, I think it was in July of 2017, the Air Canada pilots in San Francisco. I know that the NTSB isolated that as a factor. I don't know if it was there were other factors at play there too. At the time, I remember a lot of questions directed towards the government in which, and at the time the report came out especially, in which, why are our regulations not as stringent as the ones south of the border, for example? Do you think that is a good comparison? Do we need to be looking at what the Americans are doing on that?
Well, the Americans and other countries, including the international standards. So if we look at fatigue in aviation, Transport Canada has recognized that their regulations are behind the times in terms of how other countries do it, and they're also not in keeping with modern principles of fatigue science. So they've been trying to upgrade their regulations, and they are encountering some resistance from the industry. So we hope that with the Air Canada report from the NTSB, as well as the recommendation the NTSB made, with our own findings from our investigations and putting it on our watch list, that will help to move the issue forward more quickly.
Does it need to be taking this long? Because I feel like we've been asking the government the question for a long time, and they've been saying it's under review for a long time.
Well, that's one of the other issues on our watch list, is it takes Transport Canada and other change agents a long time to respond to our recommendations. And while we haven't a specific recommendation on fatigue in aviation, we've had a number of other recommendations where it's taken 62, in fact, that are more than 10 years old. So it does.
What does that say?
Well, some of these are complex issues, and we recognize they take time. There needs to be consultation, studies, sometimes harmonization, but still we can't find any reasonable excuse for why things should take more than 10 years, particularly when Transport Canada agrees there's a safety issue that needs to be addressed. So it's partly them, and it's partly the intergovernmental processes for pushing regulations through the system in Canada, which involves other departments as well.
What's your message to the government then, say specifically on the main one that you're highlighting here? I mean, there's a long list, but this one of fatigue.
Well, we think that when regulations impact on safety, that they should be expedited in terms of getting it through the system, and that it shouldn't have to take so long, that there should be a separate process for safety-related regulations.
Have you conveyed that to the ministry?
Absolutely.
And what has the response been?
Well, the issue is that in 2016, we put the slow response to TSB recommendations on our watch list. Since then, Transport Canada has missed a number of deadlines in terms of providing information back to the TSB about a number of recommendations where, you know, as to what action's been taken, whether the risk has been reduced. So right now we have 62 recommendations of almost 600 issued since 1990 that are more than 10 years old, and a third of those are more than 20 years old. So on the one hand, we need to work with Transport Canada to triage, and we started that process 2 years ago, but unfortunately we weren't able to work through it because we weren't getting the responses we were looking for from Transport Canada. But on the other hand, the other, so Justice, Treasury Board, and even Privy Council all have a role to play in getting regulations through the system.
At the end of the day, though, when you or I travel, our safety, this is stuff that affects our safety.
That's right, and many times Transport Canada agrees with our recommendations, but we've seen recommendations take 10, 15, 20 years or more to come into effect. Now, that being said, 80% of our recommendations that we've issued since 1990 have been responded to in a fashion that's considered fully satisfactory. That's not just Transport Canada, but other change agents. Transport Canada, though, has the bulk of them. So it's this last 20%, and in particular 10% of our recs that are long-standing that we want to see more action on.
And I was hoping for some clarity on one item that you removed from the list, and that's transportation of flammable liquids. I noted that today because we also got a release saying that the National Energy Board says crude by rail exports from Canada rose to a record, 229,000 barrels plus per day in August. So why is that being removed from the list? What does that mean?
When we first put the transportation of flammable liquids on the watch list in 2014 following the Lac-Mégantic investigation, we wanted to see two things. We wanted to see railway companies conduct better risk analysis when transporting large quantities of flammable liquids, and we wanted to see those liquids transported in stronger tank cars. Those actions have been taken, and as a result we felt we could remove the issue from our watch list. But that being said, we still have a number of outstanding recommendations governing the transportation of dangerous goods, and we're going to continue to monitor the situation through our investigations and through industry and the regulators' response to those recommendations.
Do you have any concerns based on those outstanding, the outstanding ones that you've raised, and when you combine that with the volume that's being shipped by rail right now? Are you, I mean, I know it's off the list, but does that sort of heighten your awareness?
Well, certainly we're paying attention to that. But that being said, there's a lot been done since Lac-Mégantic. There's new regulations in effect with respect to safety management, with respect to the new tank car standards that are being progressively phased in. Companies are required to have emergency response assistance plans. They're required to conduct route planning and risk analysis. So there's been a lot of lessons learned from that tragedy. But there are still some outstanding items that need to be addressed, and we're going to continue to push for change until they're fully addressed.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ms. Fox. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.